Greetings and welcome. Today, I'd like to share with you about what I call the Internet of the Heart. And this is about the true nature of our deep interconnection with one another and with all of life. And this is something that's being revealed now at the cutting edge of science and spirituality. I'd like to start with a talk that I heard from the Dalai Lama over 30 years ago, in which he said, if you want to discover the deepest secrets of the cosmos, there are 4 steps. First, explore the outer visible universe. Second, explore the inner invisible universe or cosmos, the psyche. Third, explore the relationship between the two. And from these 3, one can discover the deepest secrets of reality. So I want to begin with the work of a quantum physicist named David Bohm, who developed a theory of what he called the holo movement. And he defined this as the cosmos is a single unbroken wholeness in flowing movement in which everything is connected to everything else. So Bohm was a remarkable pioneer of quantum physics. He was a close colleague of Einstein. They worked together at Princeton, and they both challenged the standard Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics because that interpretation gives a statistical description of reality. And both Einstein and Bohm felt that is not the whole story. That's what Einstein meant when he said, God does not play dice with the universe. There's something deeper going on. And Bohm shared that view. And then in 1952, Bohm did the impossible. He reformulated quantum physics, quantum mechanics, based on non-locality. But Einstein didn't like it because it implied a deep interconnectedness of the entire cosmos beyond the limits of what are imposed by the speed of light. And specifically, this is referring to quantum entanglement. If you have 2 quantum particles or photons that are they're entangled, but they could be several light years apart. And if you do a measurement on one, that immediately determines the state of the other one, instantaneously. Einstein couldn't buy that because his conviction was nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. And so if you made a measurement on one, it would take at least a few years for that signal to reach the other one to even know that you'd done a measurement. But that's not how reality works. It's immediate. And so Einstein dismissed this famously as what he called spooky action at a distance, or in German, spukhafte Fernwirkung. And so Bohm reformulated that experiment called the EPR paradox with entangled photons, which gave an experimental design for actually doing practical experimental tests of non-locality. Now, Bohm's new theory inspired physicist John Bell, and he tried hard to get rid of that non-locality. Like Einstein, he said, let's get that out of there. That's too weird. And after 12 years, he realized it couldn't be done. And in fact, by his own account, he said that Bohm forced him to realize that this non-locality is foundational to quantum physics. And that led John Bell to develop his famous Bell's theorem, which is a way of testing this in the laboratory. And so the experimental tests began in 1972 with John Clauser's experiment, continued with Alain Aspect, French physicist, in 1982, which is when I started tracking this closely. And then Anton Zeilinger, Austrian physicist, and his colleagues in the 2010s. And 2 years ago, these 3 shared the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics because these experiments consistently validated quantum mechanics and showed that non-locality appears to be a fundamental property of nature. And so the bottom line, 70 years after Bohm's 1952 paper, is that non-locality is real. Bohm corrected Einstein on this, and Einstein's dreaded spooky action at a distance is not only real, but it is the basis of today's second quantum revolution. Now, this is often called quantum entanglement, but I think that term itself is a little confusing. I think a better term would be Thich Nhat Hanh's term, interbeing, that every aspect of the universe interexists with every other aspect, and that we inter-are with all of reality. So in my view, these experiments provide the strongest scientific experimental validation we have today of the inherent interconnected oneness of the entire cosmos. Now, Bohm was not only a world-class quantum physicist, he was also a pioneer of science and spirituality. He carried on extensive, deep dialogues with spiritual masters like Krishnamurti and the Dalai Lama and others. And in this quest for spiritual truth and the whole truth, Bohm really strived to integrate scientific and spiritual understanding. And to do that, he developed his innovative theory of the implicate order, which is really the science of the invisible realms, as a counterpart to the explicate order, which is the science of the physical universe and really the focus of most standard science. And this kind of was Bohm's answer to the Dalai Lama's first two steps of the science of the outer physical world and the inner invisible world. And then Bohm later developed what he called the holo movement as an elegant formulation of the intricate dynamic relationship between the visible and invisible realms. And this relates to the Dalai Lama's third step of what is the relationship between those two types of science. Now, sadly, Bohm was largely ignored in his lifetime. Oppenheimer once said, if we can't prove David Bohm wrong, then we must agree to ignore him. This is part of the tragedy of the politics of science at times. And there are various reasons for it, but I would say the main one is that Bohm was literally so far ahead of his time that his colleagues just couldn't stretch to go there with him. Now, Bohm also, back 50 years ago, he expanded on the basic understanding of the foundations of science, which are that there are two components, namely matter and energy. And those two in their interaction create all of reality. And Bohm said, no, there's a third and foundational element, which is consciousness. Now, nowadays, that's finally beginning to be accepted much more. And there are science of consciousness and conferences on this. But at that time, it was completely, way ahead of his time. And it also goes beyond E equals mc squared, because that's the relationship between energy and matter. But Bohm is saying there's a third element there, which is consciousness. And each of these three enfolds the other two. Now, this explicate and implicate orders, what are they? The explicate order is essentially that subset of all of reality that is directly perceptible to the human being, to our five senses and our mind. And the implicate order is everything else. So in a sense, the explicate order is the physical universe with 100 billion galaxies, each of which has 100 billion stars, this vast universe. And so when you first hear about this, it's natural to think, well, the explicate order is the main reality. It's the big deal. And the implicate order is just kind of a fluffy, cloud-like information field that floats around somehow. But for Bohm, it was just the opposite. And the metaphor he used, he said, the explicate order is like the foam on the waves of the ocean. And, that foam is big. It's worldwide. But it's a thin surface phenomenon, very ephemeral, and disappears as quickly as it appears. And he said the implicate order is like the ocean itself. So the implicate order is the primary reality that organizes and manifests the visible universe that we see. But the implicate order is invisible to scientific instruments and to the eyes of the flesh. Now, to show the relationship between the explicate and implicate order, Bohm used this metaphor. And if you look at this diagram, on the left-hand side, what's depicted there is two cylinders filled with a thick, transparent liquid like glycerin. And then on that top surface, if you see the black dot, that's like putting a drop of ink right there on the top surface. Now, if you turn that inner cylinder, you can see in the direction of the arrows shown there, then that ink structure starts to spread out and get thinner and fainter. And as you keep turning, it disappears altogether. Now, at this point, it's tempting to conclude that the order that was present in that ink droplet has been rendered chaotic, kind of like when you put sugar in your tea, you know, and it just kind of vanishes. But it turns out, if we now, again, looking at that cylinder on the left-hand side where the ink droplet has disappeared, if we turn that inner cylinder in the opposite direction, then what begins to happen is that ink structure starts to reappear. And as you keep turning that inner cylinder in the opposite direction, the ink droplet gets shorter and thicker, and finally the whole ink droplet reconstructs itself. And this can be demonstrated in the laboratory. So what's the point here? The point is on the left-hand side of this figure, where it's invisible, somehow the order has been preserved. It's not visible, you can't see it, but it's not gone. It's there somewhere. And then it only becomes explicate by that process of cranking, and then it comes out of the invisible into the visible. So the order has different forms. It's either visible or it's invisible. And this was the key lesson for science that David Bohm brought forward, which was this: a hidden order may be present in what appears to be random. And so much of science, when we don't understand something, we perceive we get a set of random data and we assume that that is the best we can ever know about that process. And what Bohm was saying was, no, there may be a deeper underlying order which is producing to our scientific instruments a series of random data. We should not impute randomness to nature itself. We don't know. There may be a hidden order, just like in that case of the ink droplet. It wasn't gone, but it was hidden. You can't see it. Similarly with science, there's scientific instruments and the eyes of our flesh miss certain deeper underlying order in the universe. Now this implicate order, as Bohm called it, it's hidden, it's not visible. It's present everywhere, but visible nowhere. And by visible, I mean not just with our eyes, but with all of our senses and with all of our scientific instruments. They can't detect it. It extends throughout space-time, but also far beyond space and time. So space and time are not absolute existences, which we also know from relativity theory. This implicate order represents the unseen, that which is neither manifest to our mind or five senses. And in a sense, it's a synonym for the spiritual universe, if you will. And it has multiple levels within it, which Bohm called super implicate orders. And this gets more complex. I won't go into detail, but simply to say that there is an exchange between these implicate orders manifesting downward towards manifestation, and then manifestation injecting information back up into the implicate order. And there's this kind of vertical exchange between the explicate and super implicate orders that gives rise to our experience and our universe. Now, what is this, the holo movement, as Bohm called it? What's the holo mean? It refers to the holographic structure of reality, which is an insight that has come particularly strongly in mathematical physics in about the last 35 years. And the simplest example of this is something called a Mandelbrot set, and you can see the bottom there, the equation there. Don't be intimidated by the equation. You do not need to understand the mathematics here at all. You just need an eye for beauty. But if you recall from high school geometry, when you had a little formula, y equals x squared, and you would plot out the graph, and you would get a beautiful parabola. And this is the same thing. This formula here, if we plot the graph in the complex plane, so it's in the complex plane rather than the real plane, but it's basically the same process. We have a mathematical formula, we plot the graph, and this is what we get. This very interesting looking object, which looks like kind of a Buddha lying on his side. But now, to get a sense of what this graph is, I'm going to zoom in on it. It's just a mathematical object, right? But if we zoom in on the left-hand side for a moment, we're kind of just blowing it up, so we're getting a deeper look at this. And then if we zoom in on that left-hand pinch point there, we get this. And then we zoom in again, and we get this. So we're going about a factor of 10 to 15 each time. Then that central blue oblong in the center, we zoom into that, and we get this. And then if you see that little star structure in the center, we zoom into that, and we get this. And now if you see that little black dot in the center, we zoom into that, and voila. We get this amazing exact replica of the original, but it's 136 million times smaller than the original. And yet it has all of the same intricate structure contained within itself if you zoom in on it. So what we have here is a certain sense of a mathematical structure that has embedded miniature replicas of itself on vastly smaller scales. So it's like worlds of infinity within worlds of infinity. Now, when we first hear all this, what does it all mean? In science, they call these nested sets of self-similar structures. But I would suggest this is a modern scientific discovery of an ancient alchemical principle: as above, so below; as within, so without. The microcosm replicates the macrocosm. And this has all kinds of practical manifestations in the real world. This is not just some abstract thing. Just to show you some examples, take a fern, for example. You take one leaf of that fern and you look at it closely, and it's a miniature replica of the entire fern. Or this wonderful Romanesque broccoli, if you've ever seen those. If you take a look at one of those nodules on it, that nodule is a miniature version of the entire broccoli itself. And on each of those nodules are even tinier nodules, and each one of those is an exact replica of the whole thing. Here's a more closer view of the surface of the thing. So it has this remarkable property that each part replicates the entirety. We see a similar thing in terms of tree branches. The structure of tree branches has this same property. It's sometimes called scale invariance, because it has the same structure whether you're looking at a twig, a branch, or the entire trunk, because the whole thing branches out in these repeated splitting patterns into ever more refined versions of itself. But the actual structural process of it and structure of it is the same no matter what scale you're looking at. And so they call it scale invariance for that reason. Similarly, lightning has a fractal structure. And then also, and this is where it gets interesting, the human circulatory system has a fractal structure. This is actually a photograph of the lower part of the eye. Right at the top of the slide, you can see the lower part of the pupil, and then the iris below that. And then below that are the blood vessels in the eye. And they too have this fractal structure, as does our entire circulatory system. And then the trachea and the lungs also have this same structure. So these patterns are not just abstract in mathematics, they are living within us as a very part of our very physical being. And finally, brain cells. On the left-hand side, you can see these are electron microscope images of neurons, and the scale is a few microns. And on the right-hand side is astrophysicist conception of the entire universe. And you can see the clear structural resemblance there. Now, so far, everything I've said is kind of pretty well accepted, quantum physics and scientific understanding. Now I'm going to take one little leap, which is to suggest that consciousness itself has a fractal structure, has the same holographic process in some sense. And we'll see the implications of that as we move into this. But it's summarized in the beautiful saying from the great mystical poet Rumi, who said, "The secret turning in your heart makes the entire universe turn." So there's some kind of identity between what's going on in the depths of our being and what's going on in the infinity of the cosmos. And to take a little plunge and kind of deeper exploration of this, what we're going to do is look at this video. Again, we're looking at the Mandelbrot set as an example. Okay, so what we're seeing here, we're taking another deep dive into this structure, the Mandelbrot set, which is, again, it's just a mathematical plot of that simple formula I showed you earlier. Now, as you watch this, you'll see incredible intricacy. And I want you to imagine that we're kind of looking at the interiority of the essence of reality, of the very structural essence of what Bohm called the holo movement, which unifies both spiritual and material aspects of existence. And what you'll see here is, first of all, this incredible intricacy and beauty and depth of structure. And it almost looks like, some computer scientist, took acid or something and then tried to show us all the visions they were having. But this is actually the mathematical structure of that particular object. And you'll see how it just gets deeper and deeper. And as we go in a moment, you're going to see it. There it is. You see that little fractal miniature. And so it has embedded within it all these miniature replicas of itself. And this just keeps going and going and going. This particular video goes for about 175 orders of magnitude. So it's a very profound revelation of the inherent structure of the holo movement. As we just saw in that image of that mathematical object, it entails worlds of infinity within worlds of infinity that just go on forever. And this is what I would suggest is also the nature of the creation of the cosmos. So in this schematic on the right-hand side, you can see what we just saw. There's the mathematical infinite, which is a set of all possible formulas. And then we picked one simple formula, we plotted the graph, and we got that very intricate structure of the Mandelbrot set, which we just saw. Well, I want to suggest on the left-hand side that the process of creation is very similar. We have the spiritual infinite, all possibilities. And then out of that, there's one particular spiritual seed of some kind that is chosen. And that thing gives rise to a whole level of manifestation on the plane of the physical. So we have this, with this process, I would suggest that the scriptures speak to this. For example, in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Hindu tradition, Krishna, which is basically an incarnation of God, speaks about this nature of this kind of fractal seed, if you will, and says, I am the original seed of all existence. It's the origin of everything. From me, all proceeds. My eternal seed is to be found in every creature. So we have that from the Bhagavad Gita, and then we have something very similar from the prologue of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Logos, the Word, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And through the Logos, all things were made. So in both cases, we have this kind of spiritual seed formula that is sort of planted in the implicate order, if you will, and then it manifests in the whole cosmic creation in the explicate order. So in this way, I suggest that the major spiritual traditions of the world all have this superstructure. At that highest level of the absolute, that is the undifferentiated source, and it goes by different names, the Godhead, Dharmakaya, Ein Sof, Brahman, Nirguna. I mean, different traditions have different names for it. And then on the plane of divinity, there's some kind of fractal seed formula, some kind of divine principle of consciousness. In the Hindu tradition, it's Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. In the Christian tradition, God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit. These different traditions. In non-theistic Buddhism, it's the Sambhogakaya at that level. But in all of them, they have that basic structure, and then that gives rise to the manifestation in the creation plane of these different traditions. Now, all of this was represented in a different way in ancient times through a metaphor known as Indra's net. Indra's net, and there's different images of it. These were generated on AI. And the idea with Indra's net is that you imagine a whole vast array of these beautiful glistening jewels. So you just kind of have this vast array of glistening jewels. And then if you look in the facets of any one of those jewels, you see all of the others reflected there. And so in some sense, kind of like the Mandelbrot set that we just saw, each embedded jewel reflects all the others. It somehow contains all the others in itself. Now, when you first hear about Indra's net, it's natural to make just the assumption in your mind, you see all these jewels in a big pattern, they're all of the same size, and they're all stationary. That's kind of how we imagine it. That's what AI did too. But now, if we take the idea of Indra's net and we add space and time, So what we're going to do is add spatial and temporal variation. So spatial variation means these jewels are going to be of all different sizes. Some will be the size of planets, some will be the size of stars, others the size of humans, and others the size of subatomic molecules. So all these different scales in the size of the jewels, and then we get them all moving. So we have this whole universe of swirling jewels of all different sizes. Now, if you take one of those little jewels and look in it, you'll see not only all the others reflected there, you'll see the entire cosmic dynamic motion of the cosmos, all replicated in precise miniature inside that jewel. That's how the holo movement actually works. The entire cosmic process is replicated in each fractal miniature creation within it. It's quite remarkable. So it's very much like that Mandelbrot set, except think of it in terms of a whole dynamic identity between what's happening out there and what's happening on the small scale. So the bottom line with Indra's net is it's really speaking to a very profound spiritual reality, which is that each one of us can access the full infinity of divinity through our own hearts. This is something, for example, Meister Eckhart speaks to it. He said that when God opens the heart of the disciple, God pours all of his beauty, all of his divinity, all of his infinite being into the heart, holding nothing back. It's really quite remarkable. And that is a kind of testimony from the mystics across the traditions. So the bottom line here is that you are not just a drop from the infinite ocean. You are the infinite ocean contained in a single drop. And that is a spiritual reality that each of us can access through the depths of our own hearts. And we see this attested to across the traditions. This oneness with the infinite divine is universal. We see it in the Upanishads, where there's the declaration of oneness with Brahman. We see it in the Bhagavad Gita. We see the self in every creature and all of creation in the self. In Christianity, of course, Jesus proclaiming, I and the Father are one. Same thing in Sufism, Al-Hallaj. He also, by the way, got the same treatment that Jesus did. He got publicly executed in Baghdad for declaring this identity with the supreme reality. And in the Psalms, we have this, be still and know that I am God. So this bottom line is the inmost essence of the human being is none other than the transcendent essence of the divine being, by whatever name we call it. God, Dharmakaya, of course, there are many different names. As is said in the Rig Veda, truth is one, sages call it by different names. And the key is that that deep truth is the deep truth of our own being. Now, a key path to realizing this truth is to unite and transcend dualities. Because dualities are all manifestations of a cosmic polarity symbolized by the complementarity of yin and yang. And you'll notice in this particular yin and yang, the way I've drawn it here, is that each of those little dots in the center is also a smaller version of the yin and yang. So the yin and yang keeps going and manifests at all these different scales, from the macrocosmic to the microscopic. And here's the point. The real secret of yin and yang is neither yin nor yang, but it's their sacred union which transcends both. And so there is essentially an ecstatic congress inherent in the intricate play of key dualities and polarities. And here are many examples. The explicate and implicate order that we've been talking about, matter and spirit, solar and lunar, temporal and eternal, masculine and feminine, form and emptiness, as spoken of, for example, in Buddhism, microcosmic, macrocosmic. These are all polarities which the bottom line is that the implicate and explicate orders of all these dualities unite in a transcendent unity of flowing oneness. And this is called by Bohm the holo movement. Now, this is not new knowledge. This is ancient knowledge, this knowing. This, for example, here is a depiction of the ancient Egyptian master Hermes, the thrice great Hermes. And he's indicating this same process by showing there the union of the sun and the moon, of the lunar and the solar energies. We also see it in the tantric traditions of India. This particular one is a deity, Ardhanishvara, which is Shiva and Parvati coming together. So it's a single deity that's half male and half female. And they're dissolving out of that two-ness into oneness. And from there, they then dissolve into the Godhead. We see the same thing in the Western alchemical tradition. This is just one example where you have the image of a human being that has two heads and two halves of the body, symbolizing the male and the female in one being, one person. And the idea is that when we go through this alchemical transformation, we unite the masculine and feminine sides of our nature. And this happens in all people. And we then experience essentially a sacred transcendence of that duality into an inherent androgynous union with the divine. And this is expressed so beautifully by Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the non-canonical Gospels that was found in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, I think 1945. And he says it so beautifully, when you're able to make two become one, the inside like the outside like the inside, the higher like the lower, so that a man is no longer a male and a woman and a female is no longer female, but male and female become a single whole. Then you shall enter in the kingdom of heaven, or essentially into the enlightened state. And so we see across all these traditions this notion that the unity of dualities leads you into that state of oneness with the divine. Now, when you have this revelation and realization, and you really take it to heart, then it's the impulse is to how do we bring this into reality? How do we unite these divisions and live this here on earth? And that, I think, is the fundamental spiritual quest. Once one gets that inspiration, that knowing this is possible, then we want to somehow serve that process, serve the realization of that process, and heal the divisions in the human family. Because humans have made rather a mess of things, if you've noticed, and divided us according to all kinds of categories of gender and race and religion. So in my own case, the two project areas I work in, one is gender equity and reconciliation. And that is really working to heal the divisions between the masculine and feminine, between men and women, and between all gender identities, to experience that harmony of unity, which is our birthright. And then the other project is really to bridge the religions, bringing the religions together across the traditions. So I want to close now with this image, which was published on the front cover of Nature, the leading scientific journal, in 2014. And what you're seeing here is the composite image generated by telescopes from all across the Earth and the Webb telescope at that time. And they put all these different images together to show the nearest 100,000 galaxies to our own. So you see you are here in there, and that's the Milky Way galaxy. And every point of light in this diagram is a galaxy, and the little threads that you see are the movement of that galaxy through space. And what they found was that these 100,000 nearest galaxies are all converging on this structure. They call it the Laniakea supercluster. And Laniakea is Hawaiian for immeasurable heavens. And so this is actually a composite image. It's the first time this image was ever seen of what's happening with the nearest 100,000 galaxies. And even in the journal Nature, they noticed that it looked like it had kind of a shape of a heart. Now, of course, this is a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional object. So to give a better idea of the actual shape of this thing, this little three-dimensional diagram shows you how this structure is organized. So this shows the Laniakea superstructure, and it's a three-dimensional object, as you can see there with the lines, and look how it corresponds almost precisely to the human heart. And that's quite a dramatic illustration of a kind of cosmic demonstration of this internet of the heart, if you will. And so the summary of all of this is to say that if you want to explore the infinite source, whether you do it outwardly through science and expanding into the cosmos, or inwardly through spiritual inquiry, you have to go through the heart. So thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.